Beer. This is just water, but if you want to pretend it's a glass of vodka, go ahead.
With lemon?
I don't know. Sure. With lemon. And you're right, this is a really, really heavy chair. Not even kidding. It's super heavy. Right, so this is going to be kind of depressing compared to everybody else because it's not funny and it's only very obliquely about sex.
Parts of it are very funny.
And thank you. And anyway, I hope you like it. It's called On a Horse Out in the Sticks. Augustus walked beside his horse as he was too tired to ride. A little further up from where he was walking, the road, not much more than a dirt track through the soft hills, veered slightly to the left towards a copse of trees. The trees grew straight and stubborn out of a depression between two small prairie hills. Not much more than twice a man's height, they seemed immense next to the packed dirt track cutting through the half-hearted hills of the plains. Just off the road, before the first of the trees, there was a small graveyard. 4 stones marked the burial of what seemed to be exclusively members of the Howard family. Augustus noticed that 3 had died quite young as he stopped to read the carved dates. It was as he was reading that the old man shuffled quietly out from between the trees on the patch of browning grass next to the road, startling Augustus enough that he dropped his hand onto the butt of his revolver. "Hello, friend," said the old man as he raised up his right hand in greeting. "I didn't aim to startle you. What brings you out here?" "My name's Elias," which by the way is weird because a guy named Elias does people's hair next door. I like walked by that and I was like, oh, that's bizarre. Anyway, my little aside. "Sorry, mister. Pleased to meet you. I'm Augustus Bigsby. I'm on my way to Sioux City." The old man whistled as they shook hands. "That's quite a ways, son." "It is," Augustus replied. "If you don't mind me asking, mister, what brings you out here?" "Me? Well, I live here." The old man gestured vaguely back towards the trees, and Augustus nodded. "Say, do you think you could help out an old fellow with something?" "I'm sure I could. Do you think you could get at some of those for me?" The old man pointed back into the trees, and Augustus looked at him a moment. With a nod, he judged the old man the civil sort before he turned his back and walked to the edge of the copse and peered into the relative shade. A few feet in, the ground sloped more sharply than Augustus would have thought, and became uneven with roots and small rocks. 30 feet or so down the slope, there were yellow flowering weeds growing out of a long fallen branch. It was to these the old man was pointing. Augustus didn't know what the yellow plants were called, but he suspected his wife would. Perhaps he would ask her. Before Augustus could start down the hill, the old man held up his left hand, which held a motley assortment of wild flowers and blooming weeds. "It's in my knees as well," he said. Augustus raised his eyebrows for a moment before he understood. The hand holding the flowers had swollen knuckles and slightly twisted fingers. The old man had arthritis. If his knees were near as bad as his hands, it would take the old man forever to move the 30 feet down into the overgrown depression. "They're for the wife. She loves flowers." Augustus nodded again and started making his way down the slope. The coolness under the trees shocked him a bit. He hadn't realized how used he had gotten to the glare of the sun. His horse, Sally, studied him for a moment, and he stepped into the shadow, and then, satisfied that he would not wander off, began nibbling at the dry blades between the roots and the road. Augustus made his way carefully down the slope, looser than it looked due to the clay in the earth. As he bent to pull up the yellow flowers by the stems, the old man spoke down the incline. "Say, why don't you take some refreshment with me and the missus? The road is awful dry, and the sun will be hot for a few hours more. And we seldom see any company since the children have gone. What do you say?" "Thank you kindly, mister. I'd enjoy that." Augustus made his way back to the road and gave the weeds to the old man, who carefully tucked them into the bunch in his left hand. The old man gestured and led the way to a small path that wound faintly through the trees. Augustus followed slowly, pacing the old man. Sally looked up from the dry grass and understood she was meant to follow as well. She waited patiently to give a head start, following Augustus with one eye and then stepping gingerly onto the narrow path behind. "Been here near 40 years," said the old man. "I picked this place figuring there would be water somewhere in all this shade. I was right." Augustus regarded the old man again. He wondered what he could do out here with all this grass and not much else besides raise cattle. He hadn't seen a herd or a paddock or a barn for some miles, and the old man certainly wasn't the spry type in any case. "You a rancher, mister?" he asked. "Not particularly, perhaps a little. A few cows, chickens. I was a hunter and a tracker mostly. Deer, wolf when it called for, elk in the winter, and buffalo, but not since I was younger, of course. Mostly it's just chickens now, and the vegetable garden. Retired hunter, I see. What about you, young man? You ain't a tracker. You ain't got no rifle." "That's true. I'm a farmer, from just north of DeWitt." "That's a ways, and that's an awful smart sidearm for a farmer. That's a double action, I believe." "That it is, mister." "What would a farmer need with a fast iron like that?" "Easier than hauling around a box log. I got a big farm." In that, Augustus was nearly telling the truth. What he left out was that there was no real need for a firearm at all most days on his farm, which was remote from the town of DeWitt, but not so remote from the railroad that ran to it. Only at night, in the late seasons, was there a need for a weapon. The cold would sometimes drive down wolves from the hills, not the gray majestic beasts of Indian legend, but the mean red little plains wolves, whom God had made jaws first and wiry bodies second. Augustus would sometimes have to chase them with his shotgun. Like you do. The night they got into the paddock, it was the previous September, and still too warm to put the cows in the barn all night. Augustus had drawn a bead on the closest, fired, and watched it drop in a spray of blood. One of his few cows, the one that happened to be pregnant, dropped heavily to its knees a moment later. He could see the blood welling from the peppering on its piebald side. He discharged his second barrel safely into the air to scare off the rest of the wolves. But then he reloaded and fired again after the mean little bodies that were hauling their maws away into the night. The poor cow miscarried early the next morning. After 2 days of not eating, she seemed fixed to die, so Augustus butchered what he could and sold it in DeWitt. Before he left town, he bought the revolver, swearing on the bill of sale that he would never be so clumsy again. The old man nodded. "Must be a big farm." The pair entered into a small clearing in the trees at what appeared to Augustus to be the head of the little rift, Sally trailing dutifully behind. Augustus could see a small well, a cabin, and a ransackled-looking chicken coop. Further back, there were the remains of what had probably been a barn. A few scraps of wooden shingles, gray with age, clung to equally faded posts and a fallen beam, looking like the rib cage of some long-gone gray beast. A sway-backed mule poked its head from behind the coop, regarded Sally for a moment, and then disappeared, disinterested. Augustus began to wonder what a man with a legitimate trade was doing so far from a town or a thoroughfare in such an austere homestead. Perhaps the old man had not planned to live so long, and perhaps the road had seen more use before the railroads. "It strikes me there are easier ways to reach Sioux City. The train or the ferry." "If I was not of such modest means, I may have taken one of those routes, but I go behind my wife, who did pay for a train ticket." "I see." The old man led the way onto the small porch of the clapboard cabin and held the door open for his guest. Augustus stepped into the low, dark room and smelled a slight mustiness. The man's wife sat a few feet from the door, facing the only window, which was on the opposite wall. Her frail hands were laid out on the table before her, and Augustus could just see the darkness of the skin that stretched over the backs of those hands. Perhaps the man had married an Indian woman. More than a few trackers did. That might explain the remoteness of their home. Augustus supposed that Indians didn't care much for the relative crowding of towns. He stepped to the side as the man came through the door towards his wife. "This is my Elizabeth." Augustus stepped to the table, and an image long buried in his memory jumped unbidden into his mind. It was of his mother's unmoving face. How dry she had looked in that box, and how fragile. For the sake of the poor old bastard, and for the sake of his own father, whose face from that day Augustus refused to remember, he took off his hat. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. My name's Augustus." The man gestured for Augustus to take a seat. The young man carefully pulled out an old chair and sat as he watched Elias place the flowers on the table before affectionately patting his wife's desiccated hand. "Let's see about those refreshments." Augustus willed his face still and watched the man, if only for the sake of not looking at the contents of the next chair, as he fetched an earthenware pitcher, 2 empty jars, and a tin from a shelf on the wall. "There it goes. I hope you won't mind water. It's far too hot for tea. And there's some shortbread. My wife thinks I'm too old for sweets, but this is a special occasion. Company." At the mention of his wife, Elias stroked her hand again. Augustus tried to simultaneously smile at the man and observed which hand he used to serve the shortbread. Once the man had poured him water, he was grateful to look down, and he took a sip. It tasted vaguely of clay. It seemed to Augustus that the substance must have crept into everything in this land, the hills, the water, even miles south into the soil of his own farm. Clay was far more useful to a potter than to a farmer. He let his eyes wander around the cabin's central room as Elias contentedly chewed on his shortbread. He saw, above the window, an old Sharp's long barrel with a vernier sight thumb-screwed onto the tang. The weapon had seen a lot of use. Even the scratches and small gouges on the wooden butt had been worn smooth and shiny with handling. "That yours?" Elias smiled. "Yes, it is. Best rifle ever made, that one. Could kill a buffalo at a quarter mile easy with that. Of course, now it's just a memento." The man must have been a hell of a shot when he was younger, before his hands had betrayed him. Augustus doubted Elias could either load or fire the rifle in his current condition. "You must have been busy, shooting like that." "Oh, I was. That was why I built this place for my Elizabeth. She didn't have the constitution for camp life." Augustus briefly thought about a woman alone in a house, idle hands and all that. Idle hands that could spend a man's savings on a train ticket without a word until your cousin told you about it and him only knowing but for an acquaintance that worked at the depot. He glanced a moment at the still dry hands on the table. He finished his water, save for the cloudy gray dregs. "I appreciate your kind treatment, mister, but I have a few more miles to cover before I can get to the Missouri crossing." The man nodded in understanding and rose from the table along with Augustus. "Let me see you to the road." "Thank you, sir, and thank you for your hospitality, ma'am." He nodded to the body on the chair before placing his hat back on his head. Both men walked out of the cabin. Sally waited calmly outside and nickered softly when she saw Augustus. He took her reins and led her down the path, Elias playing the host and leading the man and his horse. When he reached the road, Augustus climbed into the saddle. He looked down to bid farewell a final time. Elias placed a surprisingly firm hand on the mounted man's knee. "She's gone," said Elias. "Isn't she?" The man on the horse was suddenly cold. Elias's hand seemed a counterweight to the machine on his right hip. Mouth dry, he replied, "Who?" "Your wife. She put a river in between you two." "I suppose she has." "Doesn't matter how many times you cross the Missouri, she ain't coming back with you." "I suppose so." "Why don't you just turn around and go home?" "I suppose I can't." "Why's that?" "I have to go. I have to." "Even though you know she ain't coming back?" "I have to go," he repeated. Elias removed his hand from the mounted man's knee. He gave a grim nod, his eyes as clear and empty as a winter sky. "I suppose you do," Elias said. And then Elias stood in the road and watched as the other man turned away on his horse. He stood in the road and watched as the other man grew smaller and smaller in the distance. He stood and watched until the other man had diminished into nothing, still miles away from the river. Thank you.